Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on purchasing in a pandemic, the next steps for public procurement. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, a publishing house which serves civil servants around the world. I'd also like to thank our knowledge partner today, Mastercard, for their support with this event and for sharing their expertise and knowledge with us as well. Now, in terms of the topic of today's webinar, the pandemic presented governments around the world with a series of huge procurement challenges. So civil servants had to step up and secure supplies of PPE, of ventilators, when international supplies were really hard to get hold of. They had to launch major new services like testing and tracking, and they had to commission a whole host of essential goods, providing laptops for children in schools, for example. Many commercial and procurement teams really rose to this challenge, and they showed lots of innovation, lots of agility, and they worked with pace. But the pandemic also revealed gaps in planning and capabilities and exposed some weaknesses in traditional processes and also in those emergency procedures. And now, as we tentatively come out of the pandemic, I think governments will be looking to develop their emergency procedures going forward, should we ever have another situation like this, but also to kind of consolidate some of the lessons that they've learned from this period, to make sure that those processes are as efficient as possible, and also to look at maybe some of those accountabilities that were lost in that emergency situation. So looking at digital, looking at transparency, looking at security of those processes. Now, we have a really brilliant expert panel with us today, and in a moment I'll introduce that panel and they'll be discussing all of those issues. But once they've said their opening remarks, this is really as much about you, the audience, as well. And we will take as many of your questions as we can. So you should see at the bottom of your screens, you have a Q&A function. Please use that function at any point, even while you're listening to the panel members or immediately after, to message in your questions and make the most of the brilliant panel that we have by sending in as many questions as you might have. And just finally, before I introduce the panel, those of you who maybe are familiar with Zoom by now, you might notice there's a new function that Zoom has recently introduced, and they are automatic subtitles. So you might be seeing those at the bottom of your screen. Many people will welcome those, but if you do find them distracting and you want to switch them off at any point, there's a little icon called live transcript. It should be at the bottom of your screen, depending on how you are watching this. And you can click on that, and then there's a drop down arrow, which I think should allow you to turn off those subtitles. So without further ado, let me introduce our brilliant panel today. So first we will hear from Matthew Rees. Matthew is Commercial Hub Director at the National Audit Office here in the UK. Matthew was previously Director of Regulation and Economics in one of the Ministry of Defence's agencies, and before that worked at the NAO as well as Director of Corporate Finance. He has a wide range of private and public sector experience in accounting, corporate finance, competition policy, and economic regulation. And it's brilliant to have Matthew with us here again today. Then we will hear from Grant Johnstone, who is from our knowledge partner, and he is Head of Government Engagement Europe at Mastercard. With over 25 years of international experience, Grant brings a broad perspective, having worked across a host of sectors, including freight, IT, financial services, travel and banking. And he currently works directly with government departments and commercial entities to develop new digital processes and ecosystems. And then last but not least, we will hear from Paula Magina, who is Deputy Head of Infrastructure and Public Procurement at the Public Governance Directorate in the OECD. And Paolo supports countries to improve the legal and regulatory frameworks and institutional arrangements of their public procurement systems, helping to make them more strategic, efficient, and effective, and ultimately more impactful for the life and well-being of their citizens. And he's got over 15 years experience in the public sector, and previously was in charge of finance, HR, IT, and public procurement for the public administration of the Portuguese Central Government Shared Services Agency. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a really stellar panel. As I say, please do send in your questions for our panel. But now I'm going to hand over to Matthew to invite him to give us some opening remarks. Over to you, Matthew.
And thank you, Siobhan. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody. It's good to be talking about this topic. I just wanted to briefly give people a little bit of an overview of the NAO. Our role in the UK is probably quite familiar to people here, but for those of you who have not seen what we do, we audit all of the government central departments and a whole host of other public authorities in the UK. So we produce value for money reports, and a lot of those are debated in extensive detail in the Public Accounts Committee, and that accountability cycle is absolutely central to the improvement in performance of government departments. So what we've done recently actually is develop a knowledge strategy, and I lead up the commercial hub, which covers procurement. It also covers some of the wider commercial activities. There's been other aspects of COVID response, particularly finance support and grants right across business and cultural activities as well. So there's lots going on in the UK in response to this. So coming back to procurement, I mean, I think what you'll find if you look on our website, we can send over links, is a cost tracker. The UK government's committed over £370 billion to responding to COVID in various ways, and a lot of that involves procurement. It's been literally hundreds of contracts signed for billions of pounds. So I'm going to highlight some of those reports in a second. And our knowledge strategy goes wider than procurement. It looks at digital and risk management as well. So if you're interested to find out more about that, if you search on our website, nao.org.uk/knowledge, you can find a wealth of material. So procurement, I mean, I think perhaps the first distinction to make here is between normal times and exceptional times, and certainly in the UK, in normal times, competition, due process, fair treatment, transparency, we've all come to expect that, and I think that's a globally recognised theme for good government procurement. Then we come to exceptional times, such as a COVID pandemic. And that's where, certainly in the UK, questions have arisen, particularly about the use of urgent procedures and the lack of competition, and indeed some concerns about the transparency of the agreements that have been entered into. Our reports certainly cover all of those sorts of themes. We've looked at PPE procurement, and in that circumstance, we found concerns about the transparency post-contract. But if you actually go really back to the beginning of the pandemic, it was the lack of resilience and stockpiling that caused quite significant strains to the initial response. So lack of preparation, a lack of resilience in supply chain, no stocks, and clearly with global demand peaking, that forced the government in the UK into setting up additional responses, and parallel supply chain is I think a useful phrase, but actually what it really highlights is a lack of preparedness. So we've looked at PPE procurement, and we've also looked at things around the ventilators challenge, and that was a particular programme to deal with some acute issues in hospital treatment early in the pandemic. It's about £570 million worth of public expenditure directed towards some industrial challenges. I think if you read our report, concerned at that stage as to whether the benefits have been realised from that. Then we looked at test and trace, and we've looked at that actually twice. Most recently, 2 weeks ago, we looked at another £13 billion worth of expenditure. And again, one of these exceptional times issues is how much procurement has been awarded without a competition. And we've got stats there, about 53% of the contracts we were looking at were subject to direct award. The other issue that's very, very interesting now in this slightly later stage is the issue about who bears the risk for capacity which is provided. So we talked about the lack of preparedness. Now we've got a question about latent capacity. So when you look at our test and trace progress update, what you'll see there is that government's paying for capacity, but not necessarily using it. So we can see that through the unit costs that the government's paying for everything from test and trace to vaccine, to the the testing in the laboratories to the contact tracing exercise. When utilization is purchased and not used, clearly the unit price is very high. So we've started to look at that. So very interesting graphs in our report that shows the trend in utilization of the testing sites and the testing labs over the last few months. And so certainly that is an issue that we would keep coming back to. How much capacity does government have and how much resilience is there? I think for the long-term learnings from this, that's going to be one of the major challenges as we stabilize back into what's hopefully a post-pandemic recovery. But just going back to NEO, I mean, this exceptional times piece. I mean, this is not a new issue. I mean, I'm quite a fan of the historical records of PAC, and actually, if you go back to the period around similar set of debates actually in Parliament. So we're all living through this now, but I think one thing we need to recognise is this has happened in the past and it will happen in the future. So I guess where we sort of head in sort of closing remarks from me before we move on to other panelists is, well, what have we learned? Where do we go from here? So there's another useful report actually that draws together our findings about certainly risk management, the transparency point, some of the concerns that makes towards public trust, lots of opportunities with data. I think that there's huge advances, certainly from some of the historical examples, to use data better. There's questions about coordination delivery, including, as Siobhan said at the beginning, huge efforts, huge positive achievements right across public sector in responding to this. And then more into the societal issues around how we support and protect vulnerable people, critical infrastructure and business, so that's supporting and protect peace. And then the final point is obviously, in this extreme public expenditure pressure, our cost tracker, 372 billion, how do we resolve that into financial issues for stabilising public finance in future? So I'll probably pause there. I'm happy to come back to questions later.
Thank you so much there, Matthew. I mean, a really good place to start, because I think you've been very honest. I noticed in the questions there's already been some comments around some of those concerns that you raised about what happened in the UK. And I think you've really flagged some of those concerns around the difference between normal times and exceptional times, and maybe some of those traditional accountabilities, being lost in terms of wanting to do things very quickly, very urgently. Really good that you've raised, though, going forward, lessons learned as well. So it's not just talking about what happened, but also the NAO, I think, playing that role in terms of looking at what can we learn from this and sharing some best practice going forward. And I know some of those issues that you raise around transparency, trust, data, I'm sure our other panel members will be picking up on those. Just to say in the Q&A, somebody has asked if you could share that link, Matthew, that you mentioned there in the Q&A maybe. If you're not able to do that, I'm sure we can send that round to people afterwards, so don't worry too much about that. Thank you so much, Matthew. Grant, I'm going to hand over to you for your comments now.
Thanks, Siobhan. Yeah, hey, look, it's really great to be on the panel. So many interesting things to hear from Matthew. One thing I would say is kind of, from what he's seeing, this government's not alone. There are, as you can see on the panel behind me, we deal with governments all over the world. And so kind of to have this opportunity to talk to everybody is really great. So thanks very much. First and foremost, I'm going to differentiate a little bit between procurement and purchasing, one of which I see as the strategic intent side of the business, and the purchasing is actually the transactional component thereof. So I'm not going to interchange those as many people do. I'm going to keep procurement as strategic and then the transactional as transactional. So kind of really MasterCard, why MasterCard? What am I doing here? Well, really MasterCard is essentially a company that creates and maintains trusted networks, if you think about it. We don't issue credit cards, even though many people think we do. The banks do that. But we run the networks that transmit the data. So we're in the background, we participate in many other networks, other than payments. We're in a cybersecurity network, we run a risk management network, we've got data and other services that all run on these networks. at the end of the day, from our perspective, it's all about bringing a trusted network so that people will put their traffic and transactions through that network. So what's our role in procurement? Well, one, kind of, we looked at it. Pardon me. It's a significant opportunity for a commercial partner. You know, we see that somewhere in the region of about $10.8 trillion worth of procurement spend takes place within governments. The OECD's somewhere between 10 and 15% of the GDP. You know, there are, you know, significant benefits to governments when they consolidate and centralize and plan their procurement. I mean, they can get up to 10% advantage by doing that and having formal structured procurement things in place. So, and we believe we can help with that. There are many, many other short-term opportunities that are available too. You know, there's 66% of purchases are what would be deemed non-critical, low-value purchases. You know, so kind of you can get those out of the system. There is an incredible amount of intent to work with small business from government. And yet, even though the small businesses are keen to work with government, there are a whole host of impediments to that actually happening. So whilst the intent is altruistic, what we see in practice isn't quite at that level. And so kind of, you know, again, just to kind of re-emphasize this point, there are certainly different levels of maturity across governments. And it's not necessarily a geographic aspect. There are advanced governments in Europe and not so advanced governments in Europe. And the same goes for Latin America, Africa, Asia Pacific. But what we do find when we engage with these governments on a procurement basis, there's typically 3 or 4 major procurement goals or intents. One, I'd say, is government effectiveness, which is really about kind of reducing, you know, the costs of the, you know, using procurement techniques to get costs down, essentially. So what we're buying, let's buy it effectively. Let's make sure that, you know, we have a good strategic sourcing and have good supplier relationships and all of those good things. The other aspect that we see most often is efficiency, i.e. bring in efficiency into the government procurement teams themselves, consolidate. You know, we still see many, I mean, you know, some governments, you know, in the Australian government, I think had 113 agencies, you know, and another probably 100, you know, government aligned companies. So you've got 200 disparate, you know, and they don't all buy in the same way. They don't have the same software. They don't have the same level of expertise and so on and so forth. So kind of that's an efficiency play within government. The other aspect that, believe it or not, it has a large part to play, and certainly we see a lot of this in the government sphere, is about stakeholder management. I mean, government being government, I think they're probably more attuned to this than many private companies, but they really are trying to do a good job for the people for whom they are doing the procurement and the purchasing. And over and above that, there's obviously a social responsibility angle that comes with government. And I think, you know, that is quite different sometimes from what we have seen with corporates in the past. There's arguably a third or a fourth kind of procurement goal with government, and that's really the political objectives. Very often there is kind of a functional component, but then there is this political component that sits over the top of that. That doesn't always make things easy. And, you know, kind of people in government will get what I'm talking about there. But really, so from those 3 or 4 kind of major kind of goals that they have, we see typically 5 or 6 areas of that where improvements can be made within government and with it. And so kind of really kind of, you know, any kind of a program has a strategic intent and a planning component to it. There is then obviously the technology and the automation. And, you know, I know Bill Gates is, you know, often quoted, and I'll quote him again here. And it really talks about the first rule of technology used in business is that automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. The second is that automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. So kind of at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to say by that is that technology is only technology. Depends on what you're going to do with that, whether or not that's going to be the great enabler that you want it to be. There's a lot of issues there. And particularly what I find with many organizations, not just government, but also in government, is that you can do all these whiz-bang things with technology in the procurement end, but if it doesn't go all the way through, then it will fall over. And really what I'm talking about is, you've got, the procure to pay process, which all the way, before that even, you could arguably talk about the source to contract processes. You can put all of those through a technological kind of lens. But if your accounting side and, if you're paying SMEs 120 days, well, it doesn't matter how great your technology is or how great their technology is, they probably won't want to deal with you. So kind of, and this is the point, right? Technology is just one of those 6 building blocks. Governance, equally important or more important maybe for government than others. It is, after all, public money, and people have to be concerned about that. The organizational interfaces, who we're dealing with, how we're dealing with them, that's very important for government. We talked about the processes in and of themselves, whether they're automated, whether they're not automated, who the people are that get involved with those processes. And then, for people, the people component, as you say, is not, it's not one standard across government. There are government areas that have really good, solid capability with great technology, great plans, great strategy, etc. And then there's other parts of government where that doesn't exist. Now, some people don't want to go into a centralized procurement function. And then sometimes they do want the decentralized buying just from an efficiency perspective. So all of those things are quite important. So how does MasterCard fit into all of this? Well, there's the creation of data. There's the interrogation of data. There's the generation of insights from data. There's the supplementation of data. The data that we have is really about the transactional side of things. Included in that is all the payment. If you think about all the payments that are taking place, we see a lot of that. There is the protection of that data. And there's been enough articles in the news over the last 6 months about, governments in Europe standing up grant systems for the benefit of small business and or individuals, only to have people claiming those grants who were not citizens, were not registered businesses, and so on. So there's the protections around these systems that need to be in place. And we have a very strong cybersecurity focus. The very fact that we're a trusted network, we have no choice but to work on that. And we do, and we work on that very, very hard. But what we do is we also take that to the people that are part of our networks. All of those network connections, the public-private partnerships, we put them together. The education and training, we've got sites that, will have lots of material for training. And then, really the other big focus of ours is inclusion. And we work very hard on behalf of minority constituents. We work very hard on behalf of small business to try and bring that to government to help them achieve the policies. So hopefully I can share some of those insights as we go through. Siobhan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Grant. They're really good. Building on what Matthew said there, I think lots of issues around why people want to get better at this. So driving up efficiencies, effectiveness, but also I think you picked up on some new issues as well. So the point about inclusion and the intent to allow small businesses to have equal access to some of these tenders and contracts, but actually in practice, that's not always the case. Really important in terms of that equality, overarching picture there. And also the opportunities around kind of data, but the importance of data security, trusted networks as well, because public trust and suppliers trust in all of this is really important. And again, I think touching on what you've both said now, the importance of the whole supply chain, looking at the whole end-to-end processes, so not just the bit that you control yourself from kind of central government. So really good. Thank you very much, Grant. I'm going to hand over now to Paolo for the final presentation.
Thank you, Siobhan. I put together a short slide deck. Hopefully it will also resonate with the messages that the previous panelists shared. And I believe our experience coming from an international organization will also demonstrate that the challenges are common and many countries around the world are facing the same issues. So if we can move on with the presentation, just to give you some context, you will see the relevance of procurement. Needless to say that procurement matters for public service delivery. Procurement represents, as already mentioned, in OECD area, 12% of GDP, 1/3 of government expenditures, and procurement spend goes to different services with health topping, but also education, social protection, defense, economic affairs, and so on. And recent data just collected, and that will be in fact published next Friday in our new Government at a Glance publication, will demonstrate how the COVID-19 crisis impact procurement, and you will see the 22 OECD EU countries, the GDP increased from 13.7 to 14.9 over last year, which also demonstrates the impact of procurement. We are talking about over $7 trillion US dollars or euro in the OECD area. If we can move to the next slide, I will share with you some of the public procurement responses that were already highlighted by both Matthew and Grant. But in fact, we managed to collect this stock taking from more than 30 countries around the world last year. We also launched a webinar series that is available in our website. And finally, we did a policy brief towards the end of the year, also highlighting some of the policy responses. I will try to elaborate on them now as we move forward to the next slide, please. And you will see that it's clearly, as Matthew was saying, normal times versus exceptional times, and we are clearly under the latter. So the public procurement was clearly at the front line of the government responses. It's also an opportunity for public procurement policymakers, practitioners, professionals to demonstrate the value of the public procurement systems around the world. And as already mentioned, it was clear that most systems were capable to cope with the challenge. Governments faced unprecedented challenges, that is clear. The systems that were in place for emergency contracting were key. And in fact, they were able to be executed and put in place very quickly with all the caveats that we know in terms of sometimes transparency, but even then the governments managed to provide additional responses to these challenges. I will go through them, through some of them. So governments were key in providing these vital health products and services. But there is another dimension, which is the need to keep active contracts alive and operational. And maybe this was not so visible during the pandemic, but many contractors, they faced huge challenges in terms of the lowering demand, in terms of financial resources and issues related to their own operations. So the governments, they had to enact a lot of new responses to guarantee and to make sure that the contracts were kept alive. I'm talking about concessions, I'm talking about PPPs, both in the transport, energy, and other telecommunication and other sectors. Maybe we can go back to that during the Q&A. So the next slide will present you what the public buyers experience. So this radically new purchasing environment. And then this new also competition between public buyers for the same products and services within the same country at different levels of government. And in the slide I shared just a while ago, I didn't touch upon, but 2/3 of procurement is carried at the subnational level, which demonstrates the importance of the subnational levels, the local municipalities, for delivering on public services. So this also created an additional competition and between the different public buyers inside the same country. And of course, between countries, which also led to disruptions in supply chains with countries imposing export prohibitions and restrictions on essential goods, as we all know and we all experienced. Also some unexpected market responses, mainly suppliers demanding conditions that were not in the contracts, or even when the governments obeyed by these conditions, they were not able to deliver, even if they received advance payments, many situations as such. Higher risk for counterfeit products, of course, and then the challenge in terms of the contract management I already mentioned to you. So the next slide highlights some of the issues that the COVID-19 crisis demonstrated around the procurement function. We know that some public procurement frameworks were not strong enough in terms of the regulation and the legal framework. It was clear that most of the public procurement systems were not prepared to deal with the risk management and risk-based approaches. And this was also highlighted in the report we published around the implementation of the OECD recommendation on public procurement. We have a standard. So the OECD is a soft law organization. It's not like the European Union. We cannot impose legal conditions, but our recommendations are policy tools that our member countries are expected to follow. And that is the reason why we produced one out of, let's say, 200 active recommendations on different policy areas on procurement, because procurement really matters for well-being and for inclusive growth. And you will see that also procurement strategies were clearly not adapted, and Matthew already highlighted some of the issues that NAO found. And this lack of coordination between public entities, and for sure, lack of capacity and capabilities within the public procurement professionals also to deal with this changing and challenging environment. And in the next slide, you will see some of the policy responses that we identify, also visible in our policy briefs and reports that I mentioned to you. So in terms of emergency contracting, clearly there was a shift in terms of providing additional support. We already know the experience from the UK, but also in Ireland, even in Germany, many countries issued additional guidance. They tried to come up with also support to contracting authorities in terms of to respond to the emergency. When it comes to joining forces, after this initial competition, we saw some good policy responses in terms of the contracting authorities by launching, for instance, joint procurements. We all know about the EU under the joint procurement agreement. We also saw some centralized purchasing catching up in some OECD countries. I will name a few, for instance, Canada, Colombia, Germany, Latvia, Estonia. In countries that were not used to centralization, and they were federal countries or with different governance structures, they were able to put in place this kind of centralized approaches to procurement. It also allowed them to improve the stockpile preparedness, and we saw also already Matthew shared that clearly countries were not prepared to face the rising needs. And then, of course, there was the need to put in place some initiatives regarding stockpiling, such as the RescEU initiative, a common European reserve that was now created. Also, engaging with the market required innovative approaches. And we saw that, for instance, again in the UK and in Ireland, but also in Italy and Canada and in Spain, for instance, where these countries managed to put in place collaboration. They managed to put in place specific web pages or any other platforms that were seeking suppliers support and responses to provide key goods and services. We saw, of course, in many countries, suppliers changing their production lines to respond to additional requests. And also, of course, finally, this emergency brought up the digitalization accelerated the trends that were already visible, that were already there. But somehow with the pandemic, many governments were forced to provide an end-to-end, a full-fledged e-procurement system, or improve the roadmaps they had for digitalization of public services as well. So finally, my last slides are touching upon the role of public procurement for the green and digital recovery. And if we move to the next slide, we can see clearly that there are three main dimensions that are coming, three pillars around green, around inclusive growth, and around digital transition and transformation. And for all of these dimensions, we know that public procurement matters. Public procurement will be fundamental for delivering on each of these dimensions. And that's why I wanted to leave you with some insights from a survey we collected in the next slide about the way countries were considering the plans. And you will see that infrastructure investments are planned to take part in most of the economic and social recovery efforts from the COVID-19 countries. Half of the OECD countries will include infrastructure dimensions in this process. And that's why also developing important infrastructure governance dimensions in their own systems will be fundamental. And for that, we also adopted the OECD Council adopted last governance of infrastructure that will be useful for countries to follow in terms of the way they want to execute these recovery plans. And the next slide brings additional information around the objectives that these recovery plans will consider. And you will see that most of the countries are thinking of these infrastructure plans and align them with sustainable development, align them with the environmental or climate change action, align them with the long-term vision, and that too, and Grant, they mentioned the political objectives of the procurement function. And it's clear in OECD that all countries are using public procurement for achieving these policy objectives, be it support to SMEs, be it innovation, be it environment or digital transition, but also the social responsible procurement. And we are doing a lot of work around the responsible business conduct and looking at supply chains. And you will see in our also some reports around it. And the final slide is really to show you what we think will be the way forward for the post-COVID recovery. So this increased digitalization of the procurement processes, the increased look at risk management approaches and how to benefit from the lessons learned during the pandemic, the strategic sourcing approach and the supply chain diversification. And finally, the professionalization strategies will also be visible, and the countries already accelerated these strategies considering the investment in, because as Brent was saying, technology is just technology, but in the end, the procurement process is done by people. So my final word is just procurement is here to stay. It will be a different public procurement, but certainly it will contribute to hopefully a better future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Paolo. I think really interesting in terms of, I think there's a lot of criticism of governments and how they've responded during the pandemic on procurement issues, but you really set out there, I mean, quite rightly there's been criticism, but you did set out how challenging the environment was for governments, just the context in which they were operating, highlighted some of the weaknesses that were highlighted in their processes, but also some of the good things that came out of it in terms of innovation and more digitalization. Some of those can be used now going forward in terms of a legacy coming out of this. And really nice that you added on there, looking to the recovery plans and going forward, how procurement can be used to drive forward some of those other policy objectives, including the green agenda going forward. Thank you so much to all of our panel members for their presentations. Reminders to the audience, please do start messaging in your questions. We've got a couple come in already, but I want to start myself by going back to the panel and picking up on what, in particular, what Grant and Paolo just mentioned there about people, and this is about people at the end of the day, and investing in people, not just the technology. So my question to all of you is, do you think that governments and departments and their agencies need to invest more in the procurement profession and in the teams that they have? And are those teams currently as well connected as they need to be to other teams in departments? And do they have the right prominence and the right authority in organizations from your experience? I'm going to ask Grant to go first, because I'm sure you meet this quite a lot in the organizations that you work with, Grant. So your thoughts on that issue.
Again, Siobhan, there are varying degrees within government and across governments. So if I think in the UK, we deal with the Crown procurement services, there are some phenomenally well-educated, very capable people in that organization. Do governments invest enough into training and upskilling? I mean, I guess, you could always argue that they could invest more. And I would suggest that, given the level of change that's taken place, probably in procurement, particularly with regards to digital technology, particularly in the last 5 years, there has been significant advance in artificial intelligence, machine learning, data interrogation, data pools, economic pools. All of these things have significantly advanced in the last 5 years. Add to that a pandemic, and the pivot that's had to take place because of that pandemic. Again, not just the fact that there's new technologies, but the fact that now huge swathes of the population have discovered digital for the first time. I'm talking about, people that would never have bought anything online. I'm talking about old people who never had the capabilities for digital. I mean, my neighbors are in their 80s. They've now discovered email. I get email every day from my but, this is new. So kind of not only has the technology changed, not only has the circumstance in terms of the pandemic changed, but we've now got new digital constituents, i.e. older people, younger people, people that have never been digital. So my view is they should train more. I think what consumers are now doing, in the UK alone, I think they've twice raised the limit on contactless transactions. People are now obviously putting further trust into those systems, and that's going to change behavior. And if you're changing behavior, you need to change the response. So it's a bit of a non-answer. Yes, there are people that are very capable. There are people that need more capable. Yeah. But do I think they should be training more and investing more into government procurement? Absolutely.
Thanks. Matthew, do you agree with that? From your experience, how well kind of supported, resourced are procurement teams in government?
Yeah, I think people's really important question. And one of the most important things we do behind the scenes is try to build a collaborative engagement between government and our own independent scrutiny. So, we can come in and be pretty challenging and objective about these things quite rightly. But when you look at the profession, when we find gaps in teams and we find that people are overpowered, they're under-empowered, they're not invested in, they're not given the authority to challenge, unrealistic timescales or inappropriate decisions, then that's where the mistakes can come in. I think there's some, really hardworking people right across the procurement profession, but it has traditionally been a little bit of sort of Cinderella sort of career. So you've had a slightly unfortunate hierarchy, and sort of commercial is a label that's been attached to the sort of central pillar of this, whereas procurement has been underinvested in, and we find a lot of people in part-time or temporary employment, which is not going to work if you've got complex commercial decisions to make. So I think looking at it through the lens of a profession, a valuable role, albeit with the power of technology. I'm not saying people versus technology. I think it's about investing in the right people, and also promoting a diversity and inclusion agenda. I think that there are some certainly some inferences one could draw about the traditional hierarchical structure and the lack of diversity and inclusion. And you find vast responsibility vested in people without the authority to really challenge central decision making. And I think so. That there are massive issues there to deal with through the workforce. But yeah, I mean these are shared areas of investment, and I certainly see government commercial function in the UK now really seeing the opportunity to invest, upskilling local authority staff just as much as central government staff.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Paolo, is this something that you've seen? You've got that really good overview comparing different countries. Do some countries invest more than others in the procurement profession, and does that have benefits?
We see the countries picking up professionalization strategies, developing them. When we did the report on the implementation of the OECD recommendation back in 2019, only 20% of the countries had and now we see more than 50% of the countries already thinking of applying competency frameworks, developing certification frameworks, creating professionalization strategies, comprehensive training packages. So there is clearly an upward trend regarding professionalization. As I used to say and comment with many countries around the world and policymakers, no one thinks about being on the procurement function when they are 10 years old, right? So it's not like you want to be a football star. So they end up in procurement for several reasons. Some countries even think about it as a punishment. So we need to change this mindset. We need to really bring what's best in terms of the procurement function.
Yeah.
And that is something that is quite important when you design this kind of strategy.
I think maybe one of the things coming out of this period is that people have recognized how important it is to do this well and get this right. I'm going to go to some questions now that have come in from the audience. Grant, there's one that's directed specifically at you, building on your presentation, and it says, how can non-profit organization leverage this concept of consolidated procurement? It says technology and AI are there, e.g. how government funding corporate social responsibility funding. Is that something you can pick up on, Grant? So how can non-profit organizations leverage?
I can pick up on some of the points. So I don't know that I'll give a full answer, but certainly I think kind of it is more challenging for a not-for-profit. I mean, they have a very particular regulatory framework and a compliance framework. I mean, very often they're applying for grants and so on and so forth. And, they have to comply and report in specific ways. So kind of, I think, they need to do that because otherwise they're at risk of losing the funding. But from what I've seen, I think, first and foremost, go down some path of digitization. You will get your investment back if you digitize. Just very simply, if you use procurement cards versus writing checks or having check runs, there are already efficiencies that are going to come from that. There are efficiencies on the payment side, there are efficiencies on the reconciliation side, there are efficiencies on the data side. So digitize. You may not be big enough, but if you are big enough, certainly go into e-procurement. If you aren't big enough, then one really, as a not-for-profit, needs to start looking at forming either a cooperative or a consortia of like-minded NGOs or not-for-profits, so that you can then either work together to develop different skills and capability and or consolidation of buying, which will bring more capabilities to you, which will drive savings for you. And then kind of potentially, if your consortia is operating well enough, you can then create source function, which again will drive further efficiency and effectiveness. So not easy, certainly, but doable.
So really interesting what you were saying about government organizations working more together and collaborating. Similarly, in the not-for-profit sector, they can start to do some of those same things as well.
Correct.
Great. There's another question coming here, which is quite interesting, from Sean Revel, and it's asking about global supply chains, and it's saying that many countries do not have manufacturing anymore. Many businesses have moved that aspect to lower cost countries. They're from Canada, Sean, and they're saying, is it fair to say that every country now needs to be more self-reliant on being able to sustain their own supply chain versus tapping into many global supply chains out there? Matthew, I think this is something that
well, it's a really big question, isn't it? I mean, I think perhaps, even separate from pandemic, there's a big debate going on at the moment about reinventing the supply chain for automotive in a kind of electric vehicle arena. So, I think the question is, what does the UK think about this? Well, it's got proposed legislation for both procurement reform and post-state aid. A lot of that's sort of Brexit driven. But things like a pandemic or like a raw material shortage or even a container ship stuck in the Suez, I think it highlights that issue. So, I don't think the NAO's got the answers, but definitely when we look at the more thematic and sector-wide reports that we've done, and we've done stuff on, as I say, cars, we've done stuff on rail sector, we are definitely looking more cross-sectoral now about these kinds of issues. More in response to government. Don't forget, our role is to kind of review and hold to account and recommend. We're not government ourselves, but there are, I think this is an important theme that's being raised, and one that, a coordinated government response which covers multiple agencies is going to be necessary in the UK as well as other countries.
Thanks. Paolo, any thoughts on this in terms of supply chains?
Yes, absolutely. You know that the pandemic initiated a discussion at OECD around essential goods and resilience. In fact, the member countries asked us to look at these dimensions. What does it mean, an essential good? How can we improve the resilience of critical infrastructure, for instance? So it's an ongoing debate. There are no answers yet. Mm-hmm. Clearly, for a pandemic, we know what it takes to build on essential goods or stockpiling. But for other crises, we don't know. So crises can come from different directions. Matthew already identified some. And we still don't know what kind of mechanisms need to be put in place to deal with these crises. So it's an ongoing debate, a very important one. But clearly it will maybe change the international trade and how things are perceived by citizens. And there is also the public trust dimension around this supply chain visibility and how we can improve supply chain management and visibility. It's important.
Thanks, Paolo. And Grant, you touched on this in your presentation, I think, about understanding your entire kind of supply chain. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so absolutely. The supply chain in and of itself has many components to it, not least of which is your data. Now, and I talked about maturity of your procurement organization as well. Now, if you are a mature procurement organization, you will have a lot of data, you'll have a lot of analysis. If you aren't that mature, your first job is to get the data together. So kind of what does your supply chart look like? Who are you buying from? Is there opportunity for consolidation? Have you over-consolidated? Have we only got one supplier in a geopolitical region that might be threatened by geopolitics? I'm not going to go down that political route, but we saw this in the pandemic, where so many people had offshored and outsourced various things that they really struggled get themselves in a position of primacy when they needed it, because they were just one of many with that one supplier. So if you're going to do this, whether you're a government or not a government, forget, the entity in and of itself, your supply chain risk management is very, very important. One, do you trust the supplier? Two, do you have an alternative? Three, if we're going digital, not only is that digital channel or digital electronic data interface, if you want to call it that, is that safe? Is the supplier safe? If I'm now connecting to my entire supply chain digitally, my cybersecurity risks go up exponentially, because now it's not just my system, but I'm talking to how many suppliers in my supply chain on a digital basis. The American government with SolarWinds is a prime example of where the government had done their work on a cybersecurity basis, but one of their suppliers compromised. So your supply chain risk is not anything that you can avoid. It is a specific area of risk management that needs to take place. And I'm sure Matthew, from his audit background, will be able to tell you how they look at that. But it's something you have to look at. And so does that mean you insource everything and start manufacturing everything yourself? No, I don't believe that. However, you do certainly have to look at the risks that you undertake with regards to who you buy from and whether or not you make it yourself.
Thanks. I mean, I think we might have answered some of this already in the answers, but I'm going to ask a question which I think picks up on some of the comments that Mike Roberts is making in the Q&A. And I think Mike, probably like a few people, is quite angry with some of the things that happened, in particular here in the UK, in terms of some of those procurement issues. And I just want to ask all of you, in light of lessons learned from the last period, if governments now are to revise and rewrite their emergency procedures, so how they would do procurement in an emergency, extraordinary, as you said, exceptional time, what do you think will be different in those guidelines from what we have now? And as I say, I think you've touched on some of these things around maybe more use of digital, better cybersecurity, better use of data, risk management. But what are the big things that you think they've learned that you would like to see in guidance going forward? Paolo, I'm going to come to you first on that one.
Sure. What we see already is some countries are looking at improving risk management in their concrete procurements and tenders. So, for instance, the United States already required the public agencies to develop Plan B for risk management in terms of let's say, the natural supply chain. But if that is not functioning, what should be done to secure the goods and services? We see also these additional guidance, some additional transparency that was brought forward by countries developing, for instance, portals and platforms for advertising the so-called COVID contracts. So everything that was related to the direct awarding that Matthew was mentioning, try to demonstrate the reasons for doing so. So these kind of things are clearly coming up, and we see countries paying much more attention to the end-to-end digital procurement process.
Mm-hmm. So both that whole process again, but also that transparency, that need to be very transparent in real time about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Matthew, your thoughts on this, because you've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we've been actually working on a good practice guide that covers the whole commercial life cycle, and we'll be publishing that later this month. I mean, I think the UK government, there's no shortage of good guidance. There's no shortage of this at all, actually. There has been some clarification on the use of urgent procedures, which is welcome. And there's lots of legislation on the cards. But I think time and time again, when we go and look at actual practice, no matter how good the guidance is, people don't follow it. Claim ignorance, these are the kind of things which are not acceptable, and we're not going to compromise on that. But the question that all came up about, legal challenge, these are legal and regulatory procedures. So, there are recourse, but typically that's towards losing bidders. So the problem in this emergency circumstances is that the legal challenges are quite narrow. So transparency in fair process is important there. But this won't go away, and I completely sympathise with all the frustrations that are coming up across the audience, because at the end of the day, it's public money and public confidence that need to be protected at all costs.
Thanks. Grant, what will you be advising people in terms of better practice going forward?
Look, I mean, if it's an emergency, it's an emergency. We get that, right? However, there needs to be proper governance, and that governance needs to address things like the mandates, the policies, the operating procedures, the delegations and authorities. And if there is an emergency, they need to change. If the situation changes, you need to change with it. But we can't be developing all of this stuff on the run. It needs to be in place for an emergency. And Matthew's saying it's all there. Well, that's great, but then we need to enforce it, and we need to make sure that people follow it. The other thing that I think that people need to consider in an emergency is kind of the data needs are different. All of a sudden, we aren't buying what we always bought. The world's changed, we need different things. Where is the data? If you don't have the data, how are you going to make smart decisions? So therefore, to me, there needs to be some kind of policy, budget around how one accesses that data. The third thing for me that I think that happens in an emergency is you never have enough people. You don't have the right competencies because these people are not emergency procurement people, and you don't have enough people. If that's where the focus is now going to be, which is on the procurement and purchasing of things to manage the emergency, whether it's a pandemic or anything else, then you need to get those people in. Now, unless you have some kind of an identified list that you check regularly, and some governments do, by the way, and not in all commodity categories, granted, but in certain commodity categories, they have these plans in place. You know, you would have thought that for pandemic management, and if we'd done a plan 4 or 5 years ago, any government, then certainly this would have been part of that plan. How do we upscale procurement and purchasing? How do we change, you know, the way we operate? The project, well, can everybody use digital systems? And if not, how are we going to address that? All of these pieces have to be in there. It's crisis planning or business continuity planning. Everyone talks about business continuity planning. Well, you need to have this. And if you don't have certain components, you need to make allowance to get them in.
Yeah.
MasterCard, from a risk perspective, we gave away a lot of our cybersecurity tools to kind of low-end clinics and medical facilities because they were targeted. And just, you know, kind of, we knew that they couldn't afford to buy this stuff at us in the middle of a pandemic and in the middle of a crisis. We gave it to them.
Yeah.
But then we had to train them to use it.
And some of that goes back to what Matthew was saying about actually some of these issues arose before even the initial contracts and everything. It's about the preparedness even before that and the planning that was put in place even before that. We've got a couple of questions just to get through before, unfortunately, we have to close because time is going fast. But also just a note to the audience, just to say you will have been sent a feedback survey. It should be in your inboxes now. So if after this event you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes just to fill that in, that would be brilliant for us so that we can make sure that we provide exactly the type of events that you want going forward. So thank you very much for doing that in advance. But I'm going to try and get through all of these questions now. So we have one coming in from Canada Ben, he's called here. As countries invest in a greener recovery, I think this is picking up on what you said, Paolo, in terms of the recovery plans. Are you concerned about greenwashing in the supply chain? So is this an issue that you've considered, Paolo? And I'm going to ask you to comment on that one first.
Well, there is always a risk for greenwashing, be it in the supply chain or elsewhere when you design your sustainability programs and so on. So what we are looking at is how to improve the visibility over the supply chain, not just stay at the first tier, but go, you know, second, third tier, and understand what kind of mechanisms our countries using. And we have that quite well evidenced in our report around the responsible business conduct and procurement. And also we see countries linking the recovery plans to sustainability dimensions very clearly. So they are in fact imposing some conditions to give the money to public authorities and to others. So I think there is always that risk, but if we put in place appropriate mechanisms to follow up, to monitor, and also to measure the impact of the plans, I think that will be the challenge, how to design indicators that will be able to capture the effective impact of all these trillions that are going to be sent to the economy. We are doing our part, but I'm still curious to see how countries in particular will be developing these frameworks for measuring the impact of recovery plans.
Thanks. Grant, I want to ask you about the greenwashing issue as well, but also I want to link it to one of the issues that you raised in your presentation, which was about sometimes how small businesses, even with the best intent, can't actually secure contracts for various reasons, or when they do, they have such a bad experience that they won't come back again and do it again. Are you in favour of linking some of these policy objectives to awards, or do you think that's yet another barrier for maybe some businesses to get these type of awards going forward?
Look, I'm a very strong proponent of government dealing with small business. Incredibly important segment for every country around the world. I mean, you know, they make up probably 80% of the commercial entities in any kind of economy. They probably employ more people than big business. They also drive a lot of the innovation. So should government be dealing with small business? Absolutely, they should. Should they be making, and I think the procurement people, in all fairness to the procurement people, have policies and are altruistic about dealing with small business. However, it's the mechanisms of government that make it so hard for SMEs to put their hands up. And I think that's where we can help. You know, we've written a reimagining, we've written a policy paper that, you know, we've sent out to government that basically says to them, this is what you should be doing to help small businesses. And it's really, you know, it's giving them access to working capital, act as a protector for them, you know, in terms of, you know, the regulatory and compliance world, you know, act as an educator for them. You know, I mean, they're all getting into this digital now because they've had to. They don't necessarily understand it. They certainly don't understand cyber risk, most of them. So what are you doing to educate the small business fraternity? You know, act as a convener, act as a connector, you know, put them together, get these people working. So I'm a huge fan of that, for sure. And then I was just going to mention something about what Paolo was talking about. You know, in terms of the whole recovery coming back, we need to look at a much broader picture in terms of, you know, if we're going to talk about sustainability and carbon neutral and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm doing some work now on the Iberian Peninsula with regards to provenance, but it's not just provenance in proving that, you know, these avocados were grown in Queensland in Australia, which is an actual case that we have. But what this one is trying to do, it's trying to take the supply chain, but calculate the carbon components all the way through the supply chain. So the time it gets from this small agricultural grower to the markets, we know what the carbon footprint is of that product.
Yeah.
Will it be greenwashing? Hopefully not. And hopefully kind of you can, you know, we're looking at a blockchain kind of foundation for that. But all of these things are going to come into it. Sustainability will come into it. Inclusion will come into it. So we want small business. We want woman-owned business. We want minority-owned business. Yeah. It just makes for a better economy. And then, as I say, digital's coming. It's coming in a big wave. But what we want is safe digital.
Brilliant. Thank you. Matthew, we started with you. I'm going to ask you for your final thoughts on both the greenwashing issue, but also this issue around, you know, how can we actually make these things more accessible for small businesses?
Yeah, no, really good. It's a really good question. And we have done an environmental sustainability review on a number of departments, and we do look within those reports on procurement. One of the things you can see from that is that the MOD represents half of central government's carbon emissions, but that's only its own estate. So that's bad enough there. But then when you add on procurement, supply chain, what's known in the MOD as capability, that outnumbers the departmental estates carbon emissions are a factor of 2 or 3 to 1. So it's clearly a massive issue. Defence equipment is, you know, by its nature, heavy equipment in many senses. So there's a massive question there. So there's a lot more government needs to do to say, you know, to really wise up and understand what its supply chain is. You know, SMEs, you know, obviously that is a central issue for government. There is now an obligation on all suppliers in government to present carbon reduction plans, and departments will review that, but that's only for contracts above 5 million. Greenwashing, I mean, you know, a lot of this stuff is early days, right? Whether it's the accounting or the you know, procurement profession, getting reliable measures and metrics is a challenge. I'm also on the ICAW Supervisory Council. It's a massive issue for financial disclosure anyway. So there are huge startup and data opportunities in this space. You know, there really are. So that it is reliable. Some of the things that Grant is talking about. You know, how do you get consistent, reliable, accurate data without creating another, you know, carbon hole, which is, you know, like blockchain, which, you know, part of the challenge is data itself isn't free of carbon. So it's a massive issue. But hopefully a few pointers there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think we have just about managed to get through all of the questions. I want to say a big thank you to the audience for sending in so many great questions, but also just a huge thank you to our wonderful panel. So to Matthew, to Paola, and to Grant, thank you so much for giving us your time and lending us your expertise today. I think what's come out of this is, yes, it's been challenging. Yes, there were mistakes made. No one country, I think, came out of this without making some kind of mistakes. But at the same time, they did rise to that challenge. They did learn lessons. And hopefully we will be able to embed some of those lessons going forward to improve current processes in normal times and have a better response in emergency times going forward as well. And also the importance of relationships always comes out. Relationships, people, better use of data, better collaboration, more inclusion, and a greener future. So what a good way to end. Just to say to everybody listening, we will be sending round a video of this webinar. So if you weren't able to watch all of it, or you want to share it with some of your colleagues, you will be able to do that. And there will be an article published in a couple of weeks that will capture the key points as well. So you will be able to read that and share that with your colleagues and friends as well. And it just leaves me to say a final thank you as well to MasterCard. Thank you so much for being such a great knowledge partner with us today. And I look forward, wherever you are, to seeing you again on another one of our Global Government Forum webinars very soon, I hope. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.